Hi everyone, welcome to our first episode of WAC's Coffee Club Insights. My name is Jeremy Yu, Speakers Executive at the Warwick ASEAN Conference. Today I'm honoured to welcome Dr. Sanjay Kuttan, Executive Director at the Singapore Maritime Institute. Having been a part of multinational corporations such as McKinsey & Co. and ExxonMobil, Dr. Kuttan brings over 20 years of multi-sector experience working in the oil and gas and consulting industry, before settling into his current role in the public sector. In addition, Dr. Kuttan sits on the board of various charitable committees that promote entrepreneurship and sustainability, such as the Pro Enterprise Panel and the Sustainable Energy Association of Singapore. Given that sustainability and climate change are important topics in today's news, we turn to Dr. Kuttan's expertise to gain insights into how recent world events have shaped this ethical debate. So for my first question, Dr. Kuttan, in light of the gravest public health crisis in many years, governments have shut down economic activity to stem the spread of COVID-19, which has led to the dramatic improvement of air and water quality in countries such as China and Indonesia. This highlights the detrimental role of the oil and gas industry in environmental pollution and furthers the narrative for decarbonization efforts. Therefore, once the situation with the virus has been addressed, do you think oil and gas companies can still generate pre-COVID-19 financial returns based on current business strategies? Or will COVID-19 be the catalyst that accelerates decarbonization and the transition into renewable energy? And how do you think these major events reshape government policies and in turn affect the business outlook and model of such companies?
Yeah, Jeremy, it's a good question, and I think it's just not oil and gas companies that need to rethink their strategies. I mean, we are operating in very unprecedented times. I mean, one can say that this is every 100 years. 100 years ago, our economy was very, very different. So if we look at the oil and gas companies, we tend just to think of petrol and transport fuel. But actually, the oil and gas companies have a far more diversified portfolio of products and services. The petrochemical industry provides there's a juxtaposition between oil and gas and petrochemicals. So there's obviously production of plastics, chemicals that are used for pharmaceuticals and products as well. So I think what's key is whether demand is still going to be there. We know that the virus hasn't wiped out half the world's population, right? So people are still going to be around. Now the question really for not just oil and gas companies, but most companies, if not all, is are there going to be shift in behaviors, buying behaviors of the consumer? So our consumer is going to go back to pre-COVID spending and buying of products and things like that. I think what, if anything, because of unemployment and also the sudden realization of at least some quarters of the population that maybe a more pragmatic lifestyle is important to prepare for future shocks, because I think the narrative is this pandemic is not going to be any more once in 100 years. We might see it even closer cycles or mini epidemics. And to be prepared to weather these storms is just not about your health, but also your financial health as well. So there may be changes in the consumer behavior patterns, and this definitely will affect the ability of companies to supply goods and services. So oil and gas companies that supply transport fuel will obviously depend on a number of trends, right? It's just not the consumer, not the demand for movement of goods, because that will depend on consumers, and I think that will still come back. Maybe not at the growth rates we are used to, but also pre-COVID, there's already been a changing shift in electrification of the transport sector. So most, if you read recent reviews or surveys done by management consultants and the likes, you will see that a lot of companies are still moving forward with their efforts to decarbonize and pursue the sustainability agenda, which means the trends on electrification and reduction in the dependency on hydrocarbons is still moving forward. And these trends will still have those impacts on the need for hydrocarbon fuels, right? So that's not going to change, and I don't think that was really a COVID-19 induced scenario. It was already moving. Maybe it will either move slower and faster depending on the economies that you're talking about. But I think the general feeling is sustainability is still important. The arguments for sustainability are still there. In fact, if anything, the rise in diseases is one of those perils of climate change that has been talked about and bandied about for more than 5-6 years. If you go back to a lot of the speeches by earlier presidents and leaders in this space. So I think definitely oil and gas companies, if you're looking at them specifically, they will have a challenge in terms of looking at trying to decide on what kind of portfolio of products do they really want to start building capacity for, right? Maybe enhance the petrochemical side, produce higher quality fuels that will help the decarbonization efforts. Already in 2020, this year, we saw the IMO regulations on low sulfur fuel oil kick in, and refineries just adjusted because the demand was there and they had to adjust. The price premiums, people need to kind of decide how they manage it, whether they transfer that price premium to consumers or they absorb it within their very thin margins. I think the most important equation is us as consumers. What kind of world do we want to live in, and how does our efforts or our desire to demand for green products or green supply chain products will actually cause the major shifts that will push sustainability agenda further up the board's KPIs.
That's a great answer, Dr. Kuttan. Moving on to our second question. Singapore was the first country in ASEAN to impose a carbon tax in an effort to reduce emission intensities. Apart from carbon tax, what are other types of legislation or initiatives can ASEAN countries implement to combat climate change?
Right. I think one thing COVID-19 has taught us is we all may be in the same storm, but we all are sailing different ships. And I think the very much so with the fight against climate change and decarbonization, we're all fighting the same battle, but we all are coming from very different perspectives. And I think each ASEAN country will need to make their own decisions because the availability of resources is different for different countries, right? Some can leverage wind and solar more readily than others. Some already have hydros because of the geography. So everyone is starting from very different positions, right? But the first question is, collectively, ASEAN, does it want to be a flag bearer for the world? We've always lived in a world where it was US and Europe. And I think this is an opportunity to ask for ASEAN to say, as a responsible community of 700 million people, that we want to play a major role in our efforts on decarbonization and sustainability, right? So if that is the collective narrative, then each country will then have to decide how it fulfills its narrative with its constraints that it operates on. Carbon tax is one mechanism, and it's just not the tax, but it's actually the value of the tax, right? Whether it's $5 enough, and what are you taxing for, and who are you trying to nudge? Now, from a consumer perspective, $5 is bugger all, right? We don't even see it, right? It affects the industries and things like that to a greater degree. But so your policies has to be more targeted, right? To achieve the purpose it wants to achieve. That means, who is the target that your policy is really looking to shift the mindset and behavior, and then you got to adjust accordingly, right? Singapore has done a few things because its access to renewables is really limited down to solar in all intents and purpose, right? People talk about urban wind and everything. Really, it's not going to shift the needle, right? Solar is the only one that's going to, if anything, shift the needle. And even it does, you're not even looking at more than 20-30% of total peak demand. And when it gets fully deployed, right? And that's really a few decades away. So it really focused on energy efficiency, which was known as the 6 renewable, and the policies therein. So I think when it comes to like minimum energy performance standards, I think that's an easy policy to implement across ASEAN. So your white goods and energy guzzling goods have an efficiency energy tick, of 3 ticks and above, and that will contribute significantly to sustainable efforts. The strange thing is, as we experience extreme in weathers, that means extreme heat or extreme cold, then the demand on cooling and heating becomes so high that the equipment that delivers this service needs to be very highly efficient, right? I think the other important thing is the mindset of wastage. I think each consumer needs to be encouraged to reduce wastage, and coming up with policies that push that wastage level down. You could have tiered pricing for electricity and heat and gas, where there's a nominal design expectation of a family with X people, and then you shouldn't be consuming more than X, right? Anything above that, you kick into a tier pricing. So forces everyone to really be conscious of the electricity, gas, and water that they're using on an individual basis. And we have the technology more today than we did 10-15 years ago to calculate this and provide this kind of information. But information is one thing, so you're depending on an individual to make some sort of social moral decision, but policy can help shift that, right? And I think we are also, at least in Singapore's case, and I think maybe ASEAN could also consider, is stricter levels on emissions from vehicles and things like that. And that forces maintenance of equipment, especially vehicles. And because low maintenance actually creates an inefficient engine, which means you're consuming more than you should have per kilometer. So these kind of, it seems like a small thing, But when you add it up over 1 million cars or 1 million lorries, it does make a difference, right? I think our efforts, I think the biggest challenge for ASEAN is the use of coal as a fuel for power generation. And that's really because of there's high level of poverty in the region, and keeping electricity prices down is a major political issue, right? I mean, governments want to be re-elected, and your electricity prices are sky high. There's a high chance the government will get thrown out. So there are ways to think about this, and and we have the technology that now with IoT and smart meters and things like that. One way is to set the price of electricity and fuel as where it should be in terms of without subsidies, right? And so once you set that, then you can target communities or groups of people who are below certain economic lines, and then adjust rebates for them so that they are not hardest hit. The thing is, by keeping the prices low, the rich are the ones who are really benefiting from the low prices, and the poor are just probably just getting by. So you don't get your full returns on the investment of the asset and the cost of maintaining these assets from the consumers who can actually afford to pay for it. So a tiered pricing system may actually benefit the economy as a whole, where if you can afford it, then you pay for the actual price of it. And if you can't afford it for socio-economic reasons, then the government steps in with rebates and usage rebates. I mean, there's so many schemes that you can try to do to help the poor. You can even get down to the point where the electricity for the poor is even lower than it is today. But at the end of the day, the revenue under the curve for the entire utility company must be sufficient to cover the operating costs of the entire power system asset. So it's things like this to really kind of leverage on technology to give you the measurements that you need, or to justify certain policy instruments that come together. So we talk about being a smart nation, and a smart nation is just not about technology. It's also about smart policies that drive the behaviors that help us decarbonize. And I think ASEAN should leverage the knowledge and expertise across the ASEAN region to come up with smarter policies that help decarbonize ASEAN as a whole.
Thank you, Dr. Kuttan, for that concise and very detailed answer. I think you already alluded to the advantages of having technologies integrated into society. So therefore, it leads me to my last question. Since 2018, ASEAN countries have been focused on the development of smart and sustainable cities. This has culminated in the development of ASEAN Smart Cities Network. In your view, what are challenges in developing a sustainable city, and how would the characteristics of a smart city help to support and enforce sustainability initiatives?
It's a very good question in terms of how do we define a smart city, right? I think just step back. The whole notion of a city is actually very old, right? It is really created from the movement of people from where there was no work to where they hoped for more work to change their lives. And therefore you see this high dense areas filled with people and activity. And in those days, when our communication process was limited, keeping people close together facilitated the movement of information, and much faster that kind of kind of drove the economic wheel, so to say, right? So the city in itself kind of built from that idea of where everything is happening, and that's where I could probably get a job. So everyone moves there, and all the expertise are in. My first challenge is to this concept because communication now has improved so much, and if anything, COVID-19 has taught us the role of the office is becoming less and less important. And that really should beg the question is, do we need to have city constructs in the future? Now, the reason why I say this is the city puts undue demand on the ability to service or provide for the residents within the city because of the high density. So, for example, for a given space, the amount of solar energy you can generate on a roof of a skyscraper is insufficient to cover the first few floors of that building, right? However, if you had a 3-story building and you had a rooftop space, your solar system could cover at least 50 or not 80% of the solar requirements. So the density of energy demand versus the space that you have to generate that energy is a very strong correlation, and that works for water and other resources. The amount of rubbish you generate from a 30-story building versus a 3-story building is very, very different, which puts very different demand on the waste management system and things like that, right? So we have kind of resigned to the concept of the city being perpetual. In fact, a lot of studies point to the fact that more than 70% of the world population will be located in cities by 2050, right? So we seem to have accepted this narrative, and then we're all driving towards that. And somehow I feel that the decentralization of the city because of advanced communication, and as you can tell from the COVID-19 experience, right, decentralization doesn't really stop economic activity. Meeting still carries on, communication still carries on, right? And if we come out of the COVID-19 situation, we could still operate like this, and we could still meet people, maybe after work, for social and networking purposes, or for that odd, very important face-to-face meeting where shaking hands makes a difference. But the idea of smart city then changes, right? Because now a smart city is coming up with technologies to manage resources, whether it's water, electricity, waste, available space allocation, traffic, and everything. But this is because we have created a very dense milieu of different products and services that needs to be managed more smarter, because otherwise there's a lot of stranded assets because we are unaware of it. So this is where this whole IoT things comes in, right? To give us a sense of what's available, what's not available, how can we maximize the use of that resource, right? By better planning and better projections and things like that. So we created a solution for a problem that we created, as opposed to how can we actually remove the problem. So whatever solutions we do create can be even more effective. So for Singapore, for example, where it's already very dense as a nation, and doesn't have much land space, the challenge is greater to decentralize. However, if you know that in Singapore, we used to have in the old days shopping malls only on Orchard Road, right? But then the government got smart. They said there's just too many people all coming down to Orchard Road, right? And which made the satellite cities less lucrative to stay, because people said, oh, I got to travel all the way down to Orchard Road before to go and visit the mall, which was a big thing. But now we have malls everywhere. It's decentralized. Offices are becoming decentralized. There's clusters in Jurong, clusters in Changi, and that has kind of allowed Singapore as an island state to better manage the resources required. So you don't have an overburden of a specific node. No, there's no major power surge in a particular node, and the rest of the island is completely, underutilized. So the decentralization of a city is the beginning of building a smart city, smart planning, right? And then understanding how to make sure that you don't create undue stress in any one point within the city. Now, Singapore as an island state is a small percentage of Jakarta. Jakarta city's greater city boundaries is bigger than Singapore, right? So a smart city like Jakarta could actually look at a redesign and replanning, and to kind of spread the demand across a bigger area. So I think the smart city planning, and I think you'll see this more in the new smart cities coming up in India and China, where they're fastest growing, that better planning to kind of spread it out within the city limits will be the first step to smart city planning. And then the rest of it is all technologies, right? The communication, the ICT backbones, the sensors and things like that, and the algorithms will be developed to manage these assets and resources so that it can deliver the requirements of the residents. So we need to start rethinking how we look at cities, and kind of leverage technology to kind of be smarter in the way we manage our assets going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Kuttan. That was a very passionate answer and provided a lot of excellent details. Just going back to one of your points, you mentioned that having a sustainable sort of like solar energy on like a skyscraper is not enough to fuel the demand in that particular skyscraper. Do you see like a sustainable initiative that cities can implement sort of to combat that lack of supply from renewable sources?
Yeah, so it's a multi-pronged approach, right? And the equation is quite simple, right? Demand and supply. On the supply side, people are looking at built-in PVs, DIPVs, to kind of maximize the amount of solar generation from the sidewalls. The PV system itself is the efficiencies and conversions are going up through more and more research and newer materials. So from the supply side, you can only do so much with what you're given with. The demand side, interestingly, there's a lot more things you can do. First thing, you can design the building to be very low energy consuming, and there's a lot of standards now. You have the LEEDs in the US, you have the Green Mark in Singapore, and you have a few others in between across the world, right? So it demands a design thinking of the building to be as low energy as possible. Then once you finish the design, then it's about behaviors as well, so technology can help in certain areas. So you have motion lights and that, so people who can't use their finger to turn it off needs a motion sensor to turn off the light. Will be one of those advantages of reducing wastage. And then there's a mindset change of why do our buildings need to be at 20 degrees so that we can wear our Prada jackets, right? And why not 20 or 24 degrees, right? And everyone doesn't think about the 3 degree or 2 degree shift, but it's a lot of energy difference consumed in achieving those temperature targets, right? So then there's that kind of mindset change as well. And so then the building can be more energy efficient from a demand side that allows the supply side to at least bridge the gap. Unfortunately, at the moment, as good as solar technology is, the surface area required is still quite significant. And so the demand side design and the demand side requirements are going to be very important to help the supply side bridge the gap. And yeah, so technologies are there. It's a question of will and getting all the ducks in a row to achieve the right supply demand balance on energy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kuttan. I think that brings us to the end of our interview. It has been a pleasure speaking with you, and thank you once again for providing us with amazing insights on sustainability and climate change. Thank you very much to our viewers who are watching, and stay tuned for the next episode.